This is the Dover Download Podcast. My name is Christopher Parker, and for the past 25 years, I've had the pleasure of working with, learning from, and talking to a variety of volunteer, staff, and community members. This podcast explores conversations, activities, and a variety of policies and programs which exist here in Dover to improve the community in one way or another. Welcome back to the second of a two-part series on transparency with Nate Bernitz from the UNH Extension. Hope you enjoy it, and we'll see you next week with a regular scheduled episode.
So it's important to balance the provision of high-quality government services with the need to plan for the future.
Sure.
And so if I could editorialize for just a minute, I think one of the many benefits of being in a city where services are delivered effectively and residents have higher levels of trust in local government is that it makes it possible to do more long-range planning and strategic work. So I think in cities and towns with lower levels of trust, municipal staff and elected officials may need to devote more time and focus on the present at the expense of planning for the future. Can even be a situation where trust is so low that budgets don't get passed, warrant articles don't get passed, and things can just kind of grind to a halt. Very difficult to think about grant opportunities 3 years down the pike and things like that. Yeah, so how do you see this dynamic play out in Dover, and how does long-term thinking and planning ultimately work to the benefit of the city and its residents?
We have, I think, a considerable effort put into strategic planning. We do a couple different versions of it, and they all hopefully reinforce each other. The first is every 2 years when a new council is elected, we hold a all-day workshop with the council and senior management. And we support the council as it decides on 4 to 6 goals it wants to achieve in the next 2 years. And what typically happens is they articulate what they're looking to do, and staff is there as a resource. We're there to either talk about what might go into that, but we're not there to outline the actual process. We don't want to get that nitty-gritty at that point. The city manager then goes back and creates a list of goals and objectives that have been articulated. And the council then maybe 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, in a public meeting, expounds on that and then votes to adopt those as its goals. Those goals are then transmitted to every service area. And I use the term service area, not department, because some departments have multiple service areas within them. So we take that information and we say, okay, in the next 2 years, what do we want to do? And some of them will have budget implications and some of them won't. Ones that might not are things that we're already working towards, already into the general service delivery models that we have. At the same time, every 5 years, the departments themselves, the service areas themselves, develop strategic plans for their own efforts. And they are broken into short, medium, and long. Short being it's a year out. We should do this first year. Medium being 2 years to maybe 3.5, and then long being definitely 4 to 5 years out. So they should build on each other. They should work cohesively with each other. And then the master plan, which is the community's strategic plan, is something we work on through the planning department, and we identify goals and initiatives and objectives that, again, they're more high level. Those are captured from that standpoint. All of those things, every March, we come back to the council and we say, we're going to issue a scorecard. And then we go through with the council, creating a executive summary, as it were, of the goals and initiatives, whether it's from the strategic plans, the master plan, or the council goals and objectives, and say, here's what we've done. Monthly, internally, we're tracking them. And if you look at the city's website under our city manager's office, you'll see we track about 700 metrics every month. That all feed into the idea of a learning environment and knowing what we are working towards. But the guise of the strategic planning at its various levels is to inform us on what we're doing, what we're actually accomplishing, because the two are not the same. And maybe after some time looking back and saying, we thought this was a goal and we worked towards it, but it's really not either attainable because it's more complex than we thought, or we've had some instances where they've been so attainable that it really shouldn't have been a goal because it led to another project. It was one of those, it was almost like a false completion where you did something, you thought you completed it, and then you think, actually, if we go one step further, it'll be even better project, or it'll actually have more meaning and more value. And so those sorts of activities are what we look at, and it's one of the areas that I oversee. So I'm a little bit more passionate about it, of saying, how do we do it and how do we do it better? I love the systems aspect of that. And I think part of what we've done is created an environment where the council, when you go to a counselor or a lot of our boards, committees, and commissions and say, we should do the following, they can look at past practice and say, oh, last time they came to me with a suggestion, it was successful or it wasn't successful, and they owned up to the fact it wasn't successful. Because one of the things you'll see in the reporting is we identify that something wasn't a good idea. And we looked at it and we investigated. And for the following reasons, we said, we probably shouldn't move forward with this because the resource allocation is not worth the return on investment.
And at that point, you're hinting at accountability.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you think about accountability, and why is that important for maintaining and building trust with the public?
So I think it gets to your earlier point about the reasons behind it and your ability to pull it off. So we want the public, whether the public is a typical homeowner, property owner, or a invested volunteer, committee member, or elected official, to be able to know that the level of competency and the level of intelligence and creativity is there in the municipal staff. And you can't do that if everything's always roses. If you are always on the positive and you're always saying, I'm looking at the bright side, I think it has a subversive nature to it that says, okay, they clearly don't get it, because when your trash doesn't get picked up, it's pretty obvious when your trash doesn't get picked up. And I think it's the Watergate idea. If we look back, Watergate itself, the actual crime, was not that bad on the greatest scene. The covering up and the making it seem worse than the compoundingness nature of it, it's the same idea. If we hide the ball on something minuscule, what else are you hiding the ball on?
It's a fair question.
And so why hide the ball? Be accountable. Own up to it and say, yeah, I didn't know what I was talking about. I took a chance and it didn't work. And part of it is to be innovative in government and to provide new and creative solutions. You have to have trial and error. So if you don't recognize something as not working completely, to me, that's just an experiment, and it's building experiences. When you don't acknowledge that, that's the failure.
Yeah, and it doesn't even have to be like so dramatic, like covering up or acknowledging something that was done poorly. It could also be about trade-offs, kind of acknowledging, just like you said, that everything's not rosy, that there's not maybe one solution that's perfect. And that's ultimately part of what responsible governance is,
right.
Is saying, hey, there's different ways we can go, and there's pros and cons here, and you as the voters, our decision makers, our stakeholders,
Right.
You're smart enough to kind of weigh in and grapple with those trade-offs. And that kind of gets at this idea that public trust is actually mutual trust. And we don't talk enough about the fact that low levels of trust that we see in society, it's not just people having low trust in their government. It becomes a two-way dynamic where local officials, maybe they're wary about transparency, maybe they're wary about accountability because they don't fully trust residents. So how do you think about that? How do you grapple with that? And what does it look like for city officials to actually trust the public as you hope to earn and keep their trust?
I look at it as in our daily lives, we all have to manage our households. Government, local government is just managing our household at a more complex and diverse level. And so if we talk down to people or if we treat people as inferior, then you're just basically disrespecting them and saying, you might be able to do your own management of your own life, but you can't do mine. And I'm better at this. It's not true at all. And so it's a two-way street on that conversations point. We have to remember that at our very core, you're either doing service delivery, the plowing of the roads or the picking up of the trash or what have you, or you're advising councils or other bodies on policy and legislative aspects. And so in my mind, my number one goal is to give the actual decision makers the information they need to make a decision. That information should not be biased. It should not be slanted. It should be, here's the information we think you need. Make a decision, ask questions, get the level of comfort you have to make those decisions. But ultimately, the appointed or elected officials, they're the actual decision-making authority for most of what is. Now, are they carrying it out? Probably not. The city manager and his staff is the conduit for effectuating those decisions. But we want to have that baseline policy or that baseline direction coming from an appointed committee or the city council so that the public who votes for or supports those initiatives can say, oh, someone like me is on that board. Someone like me, my neighbor, my friends, my coworkers, they're the ones that are making these decisions. So I can trust that it's coming from a good spot. Just as, oh, Chris grew up in this community and he knows this community and sent his kids through the public schools too. I can trust him because he's got a similar experience.
You talked about giving unbiased information to decision makers. But of course, we talked earlier about how everyone that works in local government are human beings and you have opinions. Mm-hmm. How do you check that and kind of make sure that you are giving unbiased information?
I have a podcast, so no, I'm joking. That's a good point. A friend of mine is on one of the boards and we have a pretty strict rule that when we are together as friends, we are not talking about city business.
Huh.
And I've said to he and others, what's an extracurricular activity for you is my life. So I have to set up boundaries and I have to sometimes internalize. And the manager and I have a great relationship and I'll say to him, this is what I'm thinking. And he'll say to me what he's thinking in response to that. At the end of the day, I'm not a decision maker in that regard. And again, give the information that's needed. I look at it that there's so many things that I can point to that I've had the ability to work towards. We're in the McConnell Center recording this. In 2005, I was part of the team that renovated this building. I went to middle school in this building. In 2005, I was part of the team that renovated and created the space that's here today. It's an amazing opportunity. And so the flip side being that I can't say, I wish the walls were white as opposed to green or what have you, that sort of thing. That's an okay opinion for me to give up. I'm cool with that. There's so many other benefits I see. This is a much better community than I grew up in, and my son had a better community when he was growing up here. That's, to me, the better outcome.
So one of the ways that you're able to compartmentalize any personal opinions that you have is really seeing the bigger picture and not getting too caught up in short term and kind of the minutia.
Yeah. I've said numerous times on the podcast, the waterfront project, which is occurring down on River Street. I'm the project manager for it overall. I did my senior thesis in 1996 on how that project was about to start. So almost 30 years ago. Project's any day now, folks. So I have this connection to it. In my mind, that is a project. I have no emotional connection to the waterfront. I don't think about the park. I don't think about how I'll utilize elements of the park or if I'll shop at the stores or live in one of the units. It is all about how do I complete a project on time and under budget. I have removed the emotion.
Being dispassionate.
Yeah. Yep. The flip side is about 2010, I was really struggling with work-life balance.
And that was a difficult time for people in government.
It definitely was. It definitely was. I am a big believer that government has not recovered from the Great Recession, mainly because a lot of people who would have been middle management now and moving into upper management were forced out of government.
So it interrupted the leadership development pipeline.
Correct. So I needed to come up with a way to better deal with it, my stress, etc. And I found that for me, what works, and I still do it 14 years later, is I come to work in casual clothes. A lot of times it's shorts and flip-flops. And then in my office, I have 5 suits and some shirts. And once a week, I bring all the shirts home and launder them and bring them back on Monday. But people say I Mr. Rogers it because I come in the morning and then I'll go in my office, I'll shut the door and I'll change and I'll be in a suit and tie. And I do the same at 6 o'clock. The reverse process. And
Why is that important for you?
because it shows me in my mind when I'm dressed professionally, I'm in work mode. When I am dressed in flip-flops and shorts, then I'm on me time and I can choose to check my email or choose to take a phone call versus it's my job and I need to take the phone call or answer the email. And so it's a boundary setting thing. One year we were at Chico Arts Festival. Every Friday night during the summer, there's bands down in town. My wife and I, we go, and we have gone for years. And we were sitting there one Friday night, and a woman came up, and she started yelling at me about a decision. And my wife looked at her and said, I've given you 10 minutes. You can have him 8 to 6, Monday through Friday. He's on my time right now. And it was one of those things that made me think, my choices aren't just my choices. They affect my wife and son as well. He would not go grocery shopping with me for a long time because someone comes up to me in the grocery store and wants to ask a question or wants to complain about something, I'll listen. If we can make it and resolve the issue, let's resolve the issue. I didn't look at it from a 6 to whatever age he is now point of view of, Dad and I are here to get milk and cereal. I want to go home.
It's easy to forget sometimes the sacrifice that public servants make, and including their families. Yeah. Well, kind of going off that example at the park, we should talk beyond public trust a little bit, because a city like Dover is actually at its best when people trust each other. There's obviously a lot going on in Dover. You just mentioned the Arts Festival. There's Apple Harvest Day, but it's not just festivals and events. Trust can and is built between people at the neighborhood level, in communities, within communities. But what role do you think the city can play in actually fostering trust between residents, between people?
I think the more we can encourage folks to get out and meet other people and become part of the community. One of the things I love about Dover is when you look at the amount of volunteers that participate in our recreation programs and our youth athletics, youth sports, the amount of volunteerism you see at that level or at the library or some of these other areas, our boards, committees, and commissions are almost all full. Things of that nature where you see people getting engaged, and not just in government, but in community building. That to me is a trust exercise in itself. And I think that area is where we want to see people support each other, work with each other, learn from each other, and learn about each other. We are not a community that has neighborhoods to the point that, say, you hear Portsmouth where they'll talk about the North End or the West End or the this, that. I think here we've realized that you're probably connected to the elementary school. So we have the Francis G. Hopkins, Woodman Park, and Garrison Elementaries. I think people might relate to that. You sort of got a Dover Point, you sort of got Back River, you sort of got the downtown north, but I think people are more connected by those school connections. And so we've tried to recognize that. And when we've had neighborhood meetings, we try to pick those spots and sort of reinforcing that. But in a lot of ways, in my mind, that's a government support, not directing the conversation. We need to lead by getting out of the way.
Yeah, and I think people connecting through that school is one example. There are a lot of examples, the sort of civic clubs, a community garden.
Yep.
There's all these ways that people form communities within community, and those sometimes are the most important.
The community garden, at one point we tried to figure out how to do one in each ward.
Oh, really?
Because there's one up on Garrison Hill, and there was one that was sort of active on the Castle Lee parcel, which is off of 6th Street. And the planner who was in charge of that project, he actually created a playbook so that if someone came in and said, I want to open up a community garden at Mount Pleasant, or I want to open a community garden on Dover Point, then he could say, okay, here's the things you should be thinking about how to pull together, and here's some resources we've already put together. The idea being, we're going to support you, but we're not doing your job for you. You want to pull this together? Great. We'll help you. We're the government. We're here to help, but we're not here to supplant you. We're here to supplement you.
Right. Yeah, that's great. Some issues face just about every community, and I imagine Dover is no exception. One of those tensions is between tradition and development. On the podcast, you've had conversations with leaders working on bringing exciting new projects to Dover, from waterfront redevelopment to affordable housing. And Dover's been a city on the rise, which has meant more people wanting to move here. How do you respect the city's heritage and tradition and the residents who may not be as eager to see some of these projects and changes while also moving forward?
So I think we need to base our expectations through the master plan on identifying what has been successful and what might be anachronistic. So it might be historically relevant, but not currently relevant. And I look at things from the standpoint of, we should regulate the vision we want to have. Dream up. What does Dover want to be when it turns 400? That was the theme of our master plan in 2012, looking 10 years out. And we said, let's be positive. Let's say we want to be a community that, and then work backwards from that and say, okay, what regulations need to change in order to support that goal? That doesn't mean that we say there isn't good things now and that we don't want to carry those forward. We had a situation once where there was a neighborhood meeting about some zoning, and a woman got up and she said, why are you always trying to change things? Why can't things be the same? And I said, okay, what do you like? What about this neighborhood do you like and we should codify? And she said, what do you mean? And I said, you want to stay the same. You don't want to change. What is it about that you want to make sure? What do you value? What do you want to make sure is reinforced and is codified? And she said, you can do that? And I said, yeah, that's part of the goal here, is to say we like the following things. And some of those things aren't about the future. They're about what we want to see stay now into the future, that become the foundation points for that change. Everything's going to evolve. There's nothing, unless we are downtown Disney, where you're forced to look a certain way. From a development standpoint, I'm sure that there were people in the 60s that said the First Savings Bank on Central Avenue, which is a modern, brutalist-looking building, didn't fit in with the clapboard New Englanders around it at the time. Now people look at that building and they're like, that's a cool piece of architecture that isn't a mill-looking building. And at some point, other buildings will have that same sort of feel. What we look at from an architectural standpoint is remembering that it's all in the eye of the beholder. Number one. Number two, I always say you shouldn't want someone in government telling you what your building could look like or can't look like, especially me who's colorblind. You don't want me doing that. The goal should be to say, let's set up a framework and tell people, if you work within the framework, you're good. And the reality is, just as we no longer use typewriters, or we no longer use teletypes, or even fax machines anymore, to the degree that those were so pervasive 30, 40, 50 years ago, we have to recognize that other things are going to evolve too. We talked earlier about the curbside pickup. I haven't been in a grocery store in like 3 years, because I realize that it's worth it to me to spend the $2 to have someone do my grocery shopping, because mainly what I like is not having the impulse buy of walking down the aisle and saying, you know what, that piece of candy really looks good.
You're saving that $2 and then some.
Exactly. That's a total evolutionary from, in my mind, I used to love grocery shopping. It was just like an outlet for me. I have better things to do with my time. There's other evolutions at a society level and a development level that we need to recognize.
And of course, not everything is so simple. There are trade-offs sometimes, and not everyone's going to be happy with every outcome. Yeah. But it's a really great example that you gave about that conversation, where first of all, you started with engagement, and then you were able to pivot away from black and white thinking, but to keep it within, a frame of values.
Yeah.
And you avoided going from that initial place straight to the particulars, and you were able to identify values. And I think one of the important things that planners need to do is kind of keep conversations within values, and then like you need to do the work of trying to find ways to incorporate those values and honor those values within the details of how planning and zoning works.
You know, the bottom line of all development, in my perception of how we should view it here in Dover, is the more people that get engaged in our community, the better. So the more we welcome homes and units to be created, the more we strip away labels or things that separate us, and the more we create a open environment for anyone, whether it's you want to open X kind of business, great. You know, in my mind, one of the things we did downtown in 2010 was we went from, I think, 42 uses to 7. And we said, it's residential. I don't care if it's 1 unit or 10 units. Commercial. I don't care if it's a mom and pop or a national chain. Doesn't matter. Eating and drinking establishment, as long as it doesn't have a drive-through. I don't care that it's whether it's McDonald's or, you know, name your favorite local spot. It's a restaurant.
And so that's kind of an example of local government giving up a little bit of control.
Yeah. What we said was, let's be inviting. Let's encourage entrepreneurship. Let's encourage community and business development. Let's encourage more people to build downtown where our infrastructure is so it's more resilient. And let's say right off the top, you know what? Communities that don't have people moving into them are not vibrant communities. Someone said to me once, we wanted to rezone a piece of land off Littleworth Road to commercial industrial. And one of the residents got up and said, we need to leave it residential so that smart people can move in here and take your job from you. And they meant it in a derogatory fashion. But I took it as a positive because, yeah, we need those next people to come into municipal government. And they should be smarter than me. I'm a big fan. You always hire people smarter than you, whether consultants or employees, because they're going to push you to do better jobs.
Community identity is really important. You know, one of the ways that a town or city kind of develops its community identity is having its own things, its own school, its own band gazebo, its own fire and police department, its own downtown, its own history, its own decision makers. But there might also be times where there can be benefit and maybe even significant benefit from collaborating with neighboring communities. And this happens all the time. As a Nottingham resident, my kids will have the opportunity to go to Dover High School. Nottingham doesn't have a high school. When there's a fire, trucks and personnel from a neighboring community may be the ones that put out that fire through mutual aid. You've had leaders from neighboring communities on the podcast, and regional collaboration was something that came up. Many issues that face Dover also face some of those neighboring communities. Are there solutions that can be more effective, including around cost, when done in collaboration and partnership with neighboring communities? And how do you balance exploring those regional efforts with retaining that strong community identity?
I think there are issues and elements, and a good one is the emergency warming center. Homelessness is not a Dover thing. It's not a Somersworth thing. It's not a Rochester thing. It's a regional thing. So it makes sense that the 3 communities have worked together on the warming center, that we all operate together. That is not something where we should say, oh, quarters closed, sorry. That is something we should work together and say, it doesn't matter where you came from, you need to be considered and cared for. And so to your point, it should always be reviewed whether there's an opportunity to collaborate. You know, just as Public Works doesn't buy its own toilet paper and police and fire buy their own toilet paper, you know, there's value in collectively buying our toilet paper. There's value in collectively trying to solve those problems. The podcast episodes you mentioned, economic development, business development related ones, I think I said on one, if not all 5 of them, that from my perspective, the seacoast of New Hampshire, and we'll be liberal in the definition of that, reaches from Hampton to Rochester. Collectively, maybe there's 150,000 people. Yeah, that's the north end of Boston. You know, that's one neighborhood. If we didn't all have P's to rely on for economic growth, we'd all be a vastly different region.
So you're talking about this kind of in the frame of not competing with each other, rising tide lifts all boats.
Exactly, in the sense of we can work together. There are people that will say, I'm only living in Dover. That's the community I want to live in. I want to live in the seventh oldest community in the country. I want to live in the oldest community. They pick a reason. But I think when people say the Seacoast, they're pretty open to if they're moving from out of town, out of the state. So we have to look at it from the standpoint of the more people in the region, it's not a bad thing. How do we want to attract them to be here? And we attract them to be here with a variety of tools. The number one that from a community out view or reputation, as it were, I think is we take pride in our community. And one of the biggest changes I think I've seen since I've worked here is recognizing that if we're not reinvesting in our community through our capital improvements program and through our reinvestment in technology and staffing and things of that nature, why should anyone buy here and invest in their own private property? If we're not willing to take care of our roads and we're not willing to invest in stormwater management or sewer maintenance or water delivery, why would anyone want to come and live here or open a business here for that matter? So we need to have pride, and that pride can surface in a lot of different ways. It could be that Apple Harvest Day just celebrated its 40th time. That's something to be proud of. It could be that the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were created here in Dover. Again, another 40th anniversary. It could be a variety of things, but I think the more we can say, one of the areas we should be proud of is that we're a welcoming community and we're willing to work with our surrounding neighbors, whether it's through mutual aid or whether it's from recognizing that opioids recognize no boundary, homelessness recognizes no boundary. Odds are a natural event, a windstorm, hurricane, what have you, isn't going to say, we're stopping at the border, and that we're willing to work together to resolve those issues collectively. There's a reason why there's multiple communities, 232 of them in the state. We all have our own characteristics. Doesn't mean that we can't work together and we can't look to solve problems collectively for the betterment of all of us.
Do you think there's an opportunity for communities to work a lot more together? And are there any risks with doing that as it relates to public trust?
I think if you're open and honest with your collaborators and saying, yeah, I want to work with you on this, but here's what my parameters of need are, and here's where I'm going, and make sure that you're both communicating, then I think there is little risk. And I think, or at least I feel, because I would, if I were the property owner, I would want to know that the municipal government is looking to work with other communities and be collaborative, because maybe there's some resource sharing. Maybe we don't have a piece of equipment. And why should the city spend $400,000 to buy that piece of equipment when it might not get used to the full extent in a neighboring community, that we can share in that and lend them something in exchange?
Well, that's a really good example, and it's probably low-hanging fruit in many ways for communities to work more together, equipment sharing. But to give the devil's advocate view, one could be concerned that if both communities need that piece of equipment at the same time, that the community that has it is going to take priority, and that could potentially be problematic.
It absolutely could. Another example that I think has worked really well, Willamette Pond. It's a state-owned pond, because the state owns all water bodies. It is in Dover and Somersworth. And probably 20 years ago, we created walking paths and a park around it. Technically, it's a City of Dover park. Now, where's the parking for it? It's in Somersworth, because the best access point was across from or just over the boundary in Somersworth.
I can imagine that could get a little complicated.
And so we had to coordinate hours of operation and the maintenance of various elements, and it got a little quirky when some grant writing was done for some of the amenities there. But when you go up there and you're walking along the trails, I don't think anyone thinks, is that a Somersworth resident or is that a Dover resident? It truly is a regional park in that regard. And we've worked together. We've had Eagle Scouts from both sides of the border work on stretching bars and pull-up stands and those sorts of things, putting up new signage and trail maintenance that's gone on. It's been a great collaborative effort. One of the outgrowths of that was recognizing that within probably 100 feet of each other were two municipal water systems. The Dover one ended on one side of the boundary and the Somersworth one ended on the other side. And through recognizing mutual need, we created and we got grant funding together from the state to do a interconnect so that if there's a issue on either side, one can pump water to the other so that we can work together. And we've looked at that from the standpoint of we applied for and we got federal money to do a similar project with Portsmouth over the General Sullivan Bridge to create an interconnect, which would serve, I think, 14 communities in total. That's a great regional project.
How important is it that Dover has, a good trusting relationship with a Somersworth or a Portsmouth in order for those types of collaborations to be possible?
I think we have to have a relationship that recognizes mutual benefit, mutual concern, and mutual caution. It's the old trust but verify. To your point, we need to put the Dover resident first, but recognize that sometimes putting the Dover resident first is done by working collaboratively with our neighbors. And, yes, there is a welcome to Somersworth sign just over the border. But the reality is when you're driving in the Weeks Crossing area, you probably don't know where community you're in. And, it's the same Dover Bowl. So it's up Central Avenue. It's actually closed now, but it's up Central Avenue just below Weeks Crossing. It's actually in Rollinsford. Most people assume it's Dover, but it's actually not. But it's one of those things where you have to communicate with the other community. You have to work with the other community for a variety of aspects. But the average person going to that bowling alley doesn't care where it's located.
Well, it gets at this idea we talked about earlier that people kind of expect local government to work, to be the adults in the room that get stuff done. And if, it starts to become apparent that there are issues, like local government hasn't done its job.
Yeah.
So we've had this long, wide-ranging conversation, and you've talked about, I think, a lot of different ways that Dover is really, serving its residents well.
I hope.
Given, and you've been with the city of Dover for a long time, given all that you've learned in your tenure with the city of Dover and all those efforts the city's made to build and maintain trust between local government and its residents, what advice do you have for other New Hampshire communities that want to do more to build public trust?
If you've been married, you hopefully know that you don't woo your spouse and then say, I do, and then it's all just downhill from there. It's all coasting. You have to work at it every day. And I think one of the reasons why we've been successful at being transparent and building trust is because we work on it every day. It's part of our core values system. It's something that we work with our employees, new and old, to recognize and understand. And I think the fact that the council supports it is just paramount to the city manager then being able to do his job in working with all of the staff to have that as a frame of reference for us, that it's not something you accomplish. It's something you continue to work at on a day-to-day basis. And it's integrity, it's ethics, it's all of these things that we need to continue to remember. Easier to slip up than it is to do the job. So do the job because it's more valuable.
Chris, thanks for your time. Thanks for having me on. This has been great.
Cool. I've enjoyed this.